I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show. That's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics, distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is award-winning scholar, author, art historian, and Stanford professor and Yale PhD, Alexander Nemerov, the third of four interviews sponsored by Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West, and focusing on a range of topics and individuals associated with the center and the North American West, the place whose natural beauty is matched only by the challenges it faces. We are interviewing guests who have studied or written about the region in depth, its environment, culture, people, lands, history, and more. A premier place of study for Western land and life, the Bill Lane Center has become a national hub of scholarship, programming, and reporting based on three broad areas: Western governance and policy, environment and energy, and history, arts, and culture. And our hope is that this series will draw attention to the region and to the Lane Center, founded in 2005 by Stanford professors David Kennedy and Richard White. We thank the Bill Lane Center and its current director, Professor Bruce Kane, for sponsoring this series, and we invite you to visit the center's website at west.stanford.edu to learn more about its research, programs, and journalism. You can also follow the Bill Lane Center on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And now let me welcome Professor Alex Nemerov. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I should mention initially, and I did to Alex, that he has quite a pedigree. I'm an admirer of his father. Some of you who are listening may know the name Howard Nemerov, a poet who I think is in the pantheon of American poets. He's also the nephew of Diane Arbus, and those of you who know your world of photography or appreciate the work of the really highly artistic work of Diane Arbus, both of these pedigrees that he has are really extraordinary artists. And we will talk about them in the course of this conversation. But first, I want to talk about the West with you. You spent a number of years in the Bill Lane Center's flagship American West course, and you also lectured extensively in the Center Arts West program and published many articles on the American West. And I should mention, did a dissertation on Frederick Remington, who is long associated with cowboys and horses in motion and much of the West. What is it about Western art that makes it distinctive or makes it different than American art, regionally distinctive?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, you could start with Remington and say that, as you may know, Michael, he was an Easterner. He was from upstate New York, actually, right near the St. Lawrence River, and he made many of those pictures, actually, that have made him famous to this day in New Rochelle, New York. And then at the very end of his life, he died in 1909 in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And so I think the image of the West he created was largely for Eastern audiences. So what made it different? I don't know that was even of that. However, for both my dad, who died when I was 27, and my aunt when I died, or who died when I was 8, I feel like I do have a very good, robust conversation with them from beyond the grave about the creative life, and they've been great mentors to me since then, above all about the high seriousness of art, because you'll remember from those times, really there was such a thing as a religion of art. You know, they were after a kind of truth. Not a dogmatic truth, but they were after the idea of a poem or a photograph as a revelation of the way things actually are. And since then, that's become, critiqued and dismissed in a million ways. The only problem about it, of course, is that it remains an utterly compelling and persuasive reason for being an artist. So I've been able to kind of, as it were, take out my crystal ball and commune with them, because I know they're rock solid gold interlocutors with respect to what really matters in art.
Well, you wrote a book called Silent Dialogues, and that was a book really that saw an aesthetic alignment between them that you perhaps going into the book hadn't quite reckoned with. Is that an accurate way to characterize it?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, silent dialogues, which I had given as a lecture many times since 2005, and it wasn't until this very wonderful curator in San Francisco, gallerist, you may know, Jeffrey Frankel, encouraged me to publish it as a book, and actually oversaw the publication, that it saw print. But yes, it's the idea. My father really hated photography, and he was maybe the only person who thought his sister had missed her calling by being a photographer. She should have been a painter or a poet, as far as he was concerned. He detested the mechanical nature of photography. He didn't think it was a real art. He detested her subject matter, etc. So it was extremely counterintuitive for me to say that I think his poems are very much in dialogue with her photographs, and that's what that silent dialogues of the title refers to. And it was a pleasure to write. And, I'll just tell you one interesting anecdote about that, which is my cousin Dune, who is Deanne's eldest daughter and is the executor of the estate, is well known for being very feisty about who can and cannot have permission to reproduce the photographs. And her criterion for that is what, is the writer. So, for example, me saying what is accurately reflecting what her mother was trying to do or not. Because if it's not, then there ain't going to be no permission, not even for a relative. And so the interesting anecdote is that although she thought what I was saying was, I think you could say, total BS, she actually did grant me permission, and I'm really grateful for that, because the book is beautifully illustrated and allowed me to connect with the pictures in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, you were one of the few people the cousin actually allowed into this sacrosanct sense of her protecting the photographs. I want to ask you, though, I'm thinking about Susan Sontag's book on photography and just the kind of influence it had about photography perhaps being relegated to a secondary position as art. I clearly, and many others, I suspect, certainly don't see it the way your father did. But how do you see it?
Increasingly like him, I would say, maybe unfortunately, but I do teach photography. As recently as this past spring at Stanford, I taught a course called American Photographs: A Magical History. And there's some photographers I really admire. Louis Hine, the photographer of child labor 100 years ago, fantastic photographs, and I wrote a book about him. But painting really jazzes me the most. I just find it I can just move around in it infinitely, a painting that I like. And photographs have a kind of mournful beauty to them, which is infinite in its own way. I think, they're precious artifacts when you look at a photograph of the Civil War soldier, or as happened to me one time when I was looking at a book that I had checked out from the library and noticing in the stamping in the back that the last person to check the book out had checked it out in 1953. And then a photograph, which had been used as a bookmark, falls out of the book. And it's a photograph of a kind of uncomfortable, dysfunctional looking, I would say, New England family from the late 40s, early 50s. It just kind of literally fell into my lap. That's very powerful, very moving. But I tend to agree with my dad at this point.
Well, one of the controversies of his sister, your aunt, seemed to stem from her taking photographs at a mental institution. And I was struck by the fact that there were some comparisons that you made to painters, to Vermeer, to Bruegel, even to Norman Rockwell. One wouldn't necessarily see those three together, especially with Rockwell. But there's often this analogy of photographs as a kind of fine art that seems to strike a chord with people and evoke a feeling of painting. And photographs were supposed to be a replacement for paintings. For a while, people thought, why are we going to have paintings now that we have photographs? I mean, there was that kind of mentality, which proved, of course, to be obviously not, totally fallacious. But that idea of photography as a fine art, it's simply not in your present repertoire.
Oh, it is. I mean, maybe not in my present repertoire. It's becoming less so, but we do have a number of photographs in this house that I enjoy looking at. So, there are always exceptions, but I think the truly great photographers like my aunt would be ones that are bending and deflecting the medium's literalism into strange new paths that allow some of her famous sayings to really be realized most powerfully, such as a good photograph is a secret about a secret. The more you look, the less you know. Another one is, it's what I've never seen before that I recognize. And, a lot of photographs do not have either one of those qualities, but hers do.
Well, she was a true innovator, and she was a real pioneer in so many ways, an extraordinary photographer. I'd like to get your thoughts, though, about, I know you've written about Jasper Johns, for example. You've also done a whole book on, a good book called Fierce Prose on Helen Frankenthaler, who was also a real innovator and an extraordinary painter. And I mention those women because Diane Arbus was kind of, in some ways, like Annie Leibovitz. She was just a stellar figure in photography. And it didn't seem important that she was a woman. And I know people like, Lee Krasner, Frankenthaler, said it wasn't that important that they were women either. But there has been, and still is, one could argue, a lack of total acceptance of the fair sex, as they used to be called, in this world of fine art. Do you feel that's axiomatic or not necessarily even true anymore?
Well. So first of all, it's Fierce Poise is the book, which is, that's an interesting play between poise and prose. But
I always have prose on my mind. Forgive me for that.
Yeah. No, it's good. But I think that there are more and more artists who are women now. I feel like many of the artists whose work I love now are women. And who I write about and connect with. I don't know if that's a coincidence. I don't know if it reflects my own journey, but at the same time, the big course I teach here at Stanford is called How to Look at Art and Why. And that is a course based on sort of art from the Renaissance up to about 1900. And although it's not a chronological course, it's a thematic course. Like most every painting in there is made by a man. But we'd have to talk about that more, because I feel that the sensibility of the course, I think, as given by me, is very androgynous and is maybe more feminine some with quotation marks than not. In short, I think there are a lot of more and more possibilities for women now in the world of art, and their presence is much needed.
Encouraging to hear you say that. I think you are right, and I also think that I was thinking about Jasper Johns because you've written about him as well. And do you make the distinction that many do between, say, commercially successful artists like Johns, who may still hold a record for those flags and maps and all that they're able to command in the marketplace, and artists who are perhaps more, shall we say, removed from the marketplace, or art for art's sake type of artists?
I think the main thing is the artist true to their inward vision, as though there is no audience. Like they can be making work for an audience or with an audience, knowing that an audience is there and even a market is there, but they're not making it for those realms. They're making it in a purely inward way. And in that sense, it doesn't matter if they're operating in a secluded, hermetic situation somewhere or they're in the middle of Manhattan. So it's an adage, I guess, I'm giving about the power of inwardness, and artists like Johns obviously have that power. They're pursuing their own dream and their fantasy with the incredible integrity, inch by inch on the canvas and over decades, inch by inch on decades. And that's what one looks for. Any art that is trying to reach an audience runs a very severe risk of being normalized and averaged out into a kind of blended conventionality. Whether its realm is protest or celebration, it's going to tend to be forgettable, in my opinion.
Well, there's an ongoing battle, especially in American art, but also probably throughout Europe and the world globally, about art serving some social purpose as opposed to art that's aesthetic, or art that just serves the purpose of beauty and high-mindedness and, well, whatever art can provide, even in some instances, a sobering sense of the world. Do you plant a flag in either of those camps?
In neither, actually. I think I try to operate in a very simple, beautiful, open space wherein art is held to be a matter of the first importance. It's neither a response to the news cycle, nor is it a sort of escapist fantasy into either entertainment or perhaps some kind of formalist insider baseball kind of trick of the trade. It's instead touching the heart. It's speaking to a kind of emotional truth that is available perhaps to any of us, but that also enjoys being meditated upon in the formal arenas of the classroom and the essay and things like that. So you could call it it's kind of art as a religious calling, I suppose, is what I'm interested in. Where I'm sure you've had this experience, all my students have in one way or another. It matters little what the art in question is, but where you've been knocked back, you've been called, you've been summoned in the way that Rilke talks about, where you, in his phrase, must change your life. And these are unpredictable occurrences that have the flavor of religious revelation. We tend to silence or repress them in our secular culture of results and legibility. But a lot of that culture of results and legibility is of a depressingly and distressingly uneventful and ultimately kind of forgettable phrasing. And it's a kind of sound and fury. And meanwhile, these old oil paintings, or maybe a painting made yesterday or tomorrow, or not even a painting, whatever the case may be, by virtue of a kind of electric combination, lightning flash with the sensibility of a viewer, you, me, someone else, changes the world. That's where I work.
Changes the inner life, and does it have to have a universal kind of appeal?
My take on it is it changes the person profoundly. So again, say it's you or me or one of the listeners, and then that's an utterly inward individual phenomenon, the kind that is usually just dismissed as the province of like a privileged person, let's say, who can afford, while, the headlines are screaming, can afford to kind of reflect on the niceties of a flower in the field or the bird, a song of the bird. But to me, that kind of disapproval of the state I'm talking about is not only just kind of garden variety liberal guilt, it's also not recognizing the you say universal, I don't know if I would use that word, but the let's call it the relatability of one's inwardness to another. And that is something we all experience probably many times, even in a week, but we are encouraged not to really value or respect because it doesn't seem to deliver any quote-unquote real-world results. The only exception or asterisk to that, I would say, is yet it does deliver those results which have to do with our soulfulness, our kindness, our care for one another. And I think that comes out of an inwardness that art is not by any means exclusive in being able to help us gain and discover, but it certainly is a notable venue or arena for that kind of inward path. And that's my social sphere, as it were, my way of changing the world or imagining that I'm doing it is by virtue of inviting my students to reflect and to cease to regard themselves and every utterance they make as a transactable bit of merchandise in the sort of political and social world that unfortunately is proving to have extremely limited validity as a philosophy of being.
I want to explore that some more with you and probe a little bit, but I'm also struck by the fact that as a teacher like you for many, many years, I found that students often would respond to something viscerally, or they would respond to something from their inner life, as you're talking about, and then they would say, why do we have to be analytical? Why do we have to find meaning and codify or, define?
Yeah.
As if there's a real tension between those two.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of students do feel that. They feel that these experiences are so vital that, that as Virginia Woolf said, they die under the pen, that as soon as you try to put them down, they're lost. And I grant you there's a lot of, especially in academic writing, that, these joys or intensities do die under the pen or are never born under the pen, you might even say. But I don't think, finally, it's a contradiction, Michael. I think the trick is not to analyze, but perhaps, as Susan Sontag said in a famous essay, to describe, like, what is happening, and thereby to go from searching for the meaning, which is just another form of the, extensive alienation we all experience as we're constantly formed to asked to define ourselves and so on, and into a discovery of meaningfulness, I would say. So getting my students who've gotten into Stanford because they know the meaning of everything and the right answer for everything, I guess you could say, into meaningfulness feels like my one contribution to the university.
Well, you've talked a lot about the power of humanities to change our lives. In fact, you gave a famous essay, a famous lecture at the University of San Diego about the danger of knowledge. And I'd like to explore this a little bit with you in context of what we're talking about here. You seem to approach this with a sense almost of terror or fear and trembling. That is certainly what you communicated to those who were listening to this lecture. The dangers of knowledge, take us back to, the Garden of Eden and all kinds of notions that we have, not only in Western civilization, but throughout the world. That dangers of hubris, dangers of,
Right. I think, again, in ways that are pretty self-evident in the era of AI, the human desire to know everything and to and always present that knowledge as a betterment. It does have a quality of defiling and being not only resistant to, but really hostile to what is unknown, and to be celebrated as such, I might add. When my father gave the eulogy at his sister's funeral in early August 1971, and I found this typewritten sheet, the eulogy he read in his office in his papers after he died. He quoted Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, which is to the effect that We cannot know ourselves because the whole universe is in each one of us, inside each one of us. And the universe, as unknowable, is therefore plunged within us. Therein is our own beauty. And he was talking about, in effect, the secret of his sister, unknown to him and unknown to her. And their proximity to one another he regards, therefore, as all the more beautiful for being silent and unknown. And that's the kind of thing that obviously the world, whether it's in Silicon Valley or Washington, D.C., utterly, I'll use my word advisedly, hates. And yet, in standing against that hate, I don't feel daunted at all. I feel, I'll never surrender. It's a position of constant defeat, in short, to be in this position, because it's not transactable. It's not.
Yeah, but it can make you feel more alive, more vital.
Well, it does. One feels more alive, and this is what I mean. Like, one is in a constant state of defeat, but one never surrenders. And I'm not a particularly brave person, but I can tell you what I just said is not bullshit. I mean, I could not do it any other way than I'm doing. And thus I operate between these poles where, as you say, on the one hand, everything is supposed to be, super legible for this, that, or the other reason, and be, in a word, relevant. I just don't really trust that at all. And then on the other hand, what's maybe even worse, which is the art world, kind of weird mashup of highbrow sounding talk with, securitized assets gaining value in bank vaults. It's really grotesque. But again, as you say, I feel more alive, and my aliveness, despite the kind of, I'm aware, somewhat barbed nature, perhaps, of some of my responses today, is actually quite, I'm pleased to say, quite peaceful and calm and joyous. I spoke about being an angry young man, but yeah, I'm feeling a lot more love than I ever have for what I do, for those I know. And, that's a powerful position.
Oh, you're in a good phase of your life, obviously. I mean, you've had a lot of success, a lot of prominence, and certainly a lot of...
I don't think it's related to that, though, Michael. Thank you for saying that, but I think it's more of a totally inward reflection, because, like, perhaps, I don't know if you're like this, but perhaps like many writers, like, I have a hard time accepting praise or even finally recognizing anything. I've done it all, except in a kind of abstract way as a true fulfillment, whereas defeats and negative, events, etc.
seem more real somehow, don't they?
Totally. So the peacefulness I'm talking about is actually just a kind of inward path that is independent of any, talk or book or anything like that. Though I would say that the art I've studied now for 4 decades, ever since my, first days, like looking out at Lake Champlain from the 4th floor of the art history building at the University of Vermont in the early 80s, like the art and the literature have helped me as spiritual guides to achieve this whatever measure of peace, however small I may have right now.
Literature and art can also disrupt your world and often have that effect. They certainly, I would have students come to me after reading some of the tragic literature that they were exposed to in classes I taught, and they would say, I feel like jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge after reading that. They read Sylvia Plath, for example.
Yeah, I've never had the courage to assign Plath, but right. But I guess the disturbance is ultimately what creates more of the peace.
Well, forgive me, but you've had some depression in your family. I mean, not only Diane Arbus, but you're on the maternal side, I believe. There was some serious depression. Your mother's mother.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, where do we start?
Well, just start by saying you feel peace now, and that's
Yeah.
That's quite a statement.
Yeah.
Given,
Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I mean, I'm not like slapping myself on the back here. I'm saying that provisionally and in a way that really pleases me, I think I'm able to sort of be calm in a way and self-accepting maybe is the term, but depression, absolutely. How about my own depression? But I think, I feel I self-nominate as the cheeriest of the Nemerovs, actually, like counting my two brothers and my parents. But yes, it's a thing. It's a dark night of the soul, and one becomes stronger from it. But what are the costs? I'm not really sure. It's actually a debate in the class I'm teaching right now, because I've introduced this term very adjacent to depression called the sick soul. I don't know if you've encountered that, but it's from William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, a book published in 1902. And James is just making the point, almost commonsensical point, that the sick soul, the person who is at odds with the world or sees the skeleton at the banquet, as he famously said, while everyone else is convivial, has more insight into life than someone of what he calls systematic healthy-mindedness. And so my students are interested in that, because the idea of seeing the flower in the field in its true radiance, as Van Gogh might have seen it, speaking of sick souls, do you exclusively need to have traveled into the valley of depression, et cetera, and crisis to be able to experience the radiance, or can you, Professor, be more like another one of your heroes, Emerson, who is just crossing a bare common? He's not in a good mood, he's not in a bad mood, but he experiences an exhilaration almost like fear, and is lifted up and becomes, as he says, a transparent eyeball. He sees all, feels all. And I say it can be both, and I think I have both of those qualities. I think I live on Emerson Street here in Palo Alto, and I think I'm very much of an Emersonian, which is to say an American idiot, a kind of naive Billy Budd, Huck Finn type who just kind of can experience what in Terrence Malick's movie Thin Red Line is described repeatedly by Private Wit as the shining, the shine, all things shining. I see that, and yet conversely, I'm a sick soul, and I don't think it's really a contradiction. So, in terms of teaching, I would just say my students, I think my students...
Like Whitman said, you contain multitudes.
Well, I contain at least two people, yeah. But yeah, exactly.
And I was thinking about it when he says, do I contradict myself? Well, then I contradict myself.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, I think that's a good point.
And I'm also struck by the way you've integrated so much learning into getting more at this phase of life sanguine almost. You're sounding sanguine to me in this self-assessment of calm, which I think is, you've been through it. I keep thinking about what Hawthorne said about the negative path. You go through that and somehow life seems more to be a positive or an elevating kind of thing. And especially you use art for those purposes, just like you may have used it to feel down, which brings me to kind of another question that intrigues me in terms of finding what your answer is to it. When you have students look for meaning in a work of art, or analyze a work of art, or interpret a work of art, do they look inwardly, or do they look at the work itself, Or do they try to integrate those two? Or are they looking outside to other sources that can shed scholarly light? Where's the emphasis? Where the emphasis ought to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think ideally it is in the interrelation between the art and the person, with the important caveat that the art should exert a resistance or friction to what one, quote unquote, wants to say about it, so that one does not simply egotistically impose one's attitudes onto the work without the work resisting that to some extent. And the blend then, which can include scholarly research, et cetera, to support or, rebut one's claims, is the art of writing a meaningful essay.
Well, which makes me think of your most recent book, Forest. You go back to 1830. You go back to a time when, forests were abundant. And I think about Hawthorne again and how the forest plays a central role in so much of his work. But it's a pagan place. It's a place of freedom. It's a place of liberation. Mm-hmm. And it's where Hester Prynne goes and takes off the letter, for example. I'm struck by the fact that you wanted to go back and you wanted to maybe see something pristine through the eyes of a poet almost. I mean, you're more of a nonfiction writer in some ways as well as a scholar in that book, aren't you?
Yeah, that book is fiction and nonfiction, and it's all set in the 1830s, and just, as you say, like the last moment when there are still forests, primeval forests in the U.S., and I wanted to write about that encounter, that last encounter between those epic spaces and then not only the society, but really different mystical figures, including Hawthorne himself, but also others of my own invention who experienced something of that, whatever you would call it, dark radiance of the forest, and drew from it in some way. And yeah, I think the way I conceived that book was, why should I be constrained by the facts to tell what is true? And so I wanted to give a full narrative scope to my imagination and blend that imagination with a deep knowledge of the 1830s in America to give the reader a kind of tapestry of different episodes. There are 57 different episodes in the book. Each one is basically just a vignette. It's like a short piece. And I wrote it during COVID, and it was such a lovely thing to write. And it's been praised by Annie Proulx and Edmund Duvall and a lot of others. And I'm so glad I did it. I love it. I think it's my best book.
Is it habitual to think your most recent book is your best book? They say axiomatic for authors often to feel that way.
Is that right? I've never heard that, but I would say in my case, it's not habitual. Although, I don't know, you've got me thinking maybe I say that after every book, but I think The Forest is...
Well, forgive me, it's a very different kind of book for you, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of my sense, is that this book feels very free to me. Fierce Poise also was very free for me, though, in a different way. I think every book one writes changes one, and you come out a different person at the other side. And it's funny because the book comes out of your own mind, yet it really is taking its own shape, which then refers back to you and tells you who you are and who you have been and who you might be. I don't know. I was always the person in the classroom who was staring out the window during the lessons and getting in trouble with the teacher. I think...
So what do you do when someone's in your classroom staring out the window?
Well, there ain't no windows to stare out of, but there sure are phones and computers to use. But I just ban them in class, and which, surprise, like actually really helps the learning environment. But people still violate it from time to time, and then I have to be a mean professor, but, I don't relish that.
Yeah, well, it's hard to imagine you being too mean. I think, especially when you speak of kindness, and kindness is really an important virtue, isn't it?
It is, and I'm still struggling, speaking of meanness, though, to get the ratio right, because to be kind and to actually, if you like, succeed at being kind, which is, in my case, being fortunate enough to have a platform to really articulate in depth and at length what it is I might have in mind. And by the way, all within my own failings and fragility as a person. Like I'm not perfect by any means, but I'm trying my best. You have to have in ice hockey, I'm an ice hockey fan, there's a term for people who, they don't necessarily fight, but they don't give an inch on the ice, and it's called jam. Like you have to have some jam. And so to kind of have the platform. And so I'm not usually very self-complimentary, but I do appreciate that I have some jam. And, in short, I don't take a lot of shit.
You've got aggression.
I don't seek conflict. I avoid conflict, but I try not to, I guess, I don't know, this isn't really the right way to put it, but the kindness deserves to be taken seriously, or whatever it is, the generosity, the honesty of spirit, which succeeds and fails at the same time by virtue of just trying to create a space in which something of possible import is articulated. In short, the classroom, in short, teaching, in short, learning. Like it all seems, consequential enough to be treated in earnest. And when the earnestness is contaminated or blocked, I think then I can show some jam. Yeah.
Well, is there any American artist who rises above that your jam wants to jam with more than, let's say, the other artists? Is there an artist, for example, if you had to select one to put in a space capsule, the old saw about doing that sort of thing, is there any single artist who has...
In order to do what? To be in my pantheon, or to
be in your pantheon as well as to be in the future that's going to endure or deserves to endure more than others?
There's a painter I teach every year who's probably the greatest American painter that no one's ever heard of, named Dennis Miller Bunker. And he was quite exceptionally gifted painter. Perhaps one reason no one knows of him is he died at age 29 in 1890. But he made a painting, which is actually at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, called Wild Asters. And it's one of several he made of a field, a meadow, a sunlit, grassy field with a blue stream running through it in the town of Medfield, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1889. And I speak about it in terms of the clearing, like a clearing, a space, an open space, finally a kind of heavenly space in which we're free of judgment and urging and moral posturing of any kind, and instead we're just allowed to be and be in relation to the world's being. I think that painting is one I would nominate for others to see, though, you know what the kind of kicker is that painting is beheld, but that painting is only regarded as a pretty impressionist painting. I'm the only one who sees it in the way I do, though it must be said my students see it in the way I do after they've heard about it, because they tend to just love this. But my point being that, you and I, Michael, from the best of intentions, could each put our pictures that we choose into some sort of capsule for the future to benefit by, and that future unveiling the capsule would then say, that's a really pretty picture, I'm going to sell it, or I'm going to show it and celebrate it because it reminds me of a time when I went on vacation, that, or the other place. In short, the plenitude that art offers tends to be seen, unfortunately, only by a few, or that is valued by a few. And I regret that art is given.
Well, it's given often short shrift. It's something almost to feel grievous about. You know, people go in a museum and they'll look at a painting and they'll look at it for a few seconds and then they'll move on to the next painting.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I don't know quite how to understand that, except per our conversation about peacefulness. I've been trying to make peace with that because it is hard to go to a museum and on the best of days. I mean, and especially if one is alienated from whatever art may have to offer. Yeah, it's hard. One can only attend finally to one's own business. So in that sense, I would probably send the capsule to myself and myself only in the future. Unless that sounds too hard-hearted or self-absorbed, I would say one continues to practice inwardness even from beyond the grave, and in such a way by one's thoughts and maybe sometimes by one's works, one continues to change the world.
Well, big question, and we're short on time. Can that lead to solipsism? Is that a danger?
Absolutely, it can. But, and I think I'm often, especially by academics who tend to regard, I mean, it's very politicized culture, and you're always supposed to be making a contribution to some community of some kind and speaking a kind of group speak of some kind. So I think I am often regarded as a solipsist, but it feels more like an emptying of self to me from the inside, to a little bit like that verse from Ecclesiastes I was talking about, like discovering not a normative, possessive individualism of oneself, where one is a super cool being and here are my thoughts, but rather the opposite, like one seems to become a kind of vessel for the articulation of things that are beyond oneself. And, I get that insofar as the world claims to not need or value such a mode and to regard it with a suspicion as superstition, I get that it's, I get the criticism. The only thing about the criticism is that it's wrong. And it's wrong not just about me, but it's wrong about the critic themselves, who, whoever they may be, who I would encourage to value more the way that they are a thing of beauty, that they are created by forces and powers that far exceed the measly driver's license or passport credibility of their so-called individual personhood, and that the point and click of their purchase on the computer and their ownership of different things and their so-called, this is my least favorite phrase in the whole world, their bucket lists of things to do and accomplish, is just such a meager way to construe the precious time one has on earth. I encourage them to, as Kierkegaard would say, not live in the basement of their own house.
On that note from Kierkegaard, let me just say that this episode, again, has been supported by Stanford's Bill Lane Center for the American West, Stanford's premier place for study of the past, present, and future of Western North America. And you can learn more about the Bill Lane Center at west.stanford.edu or follow them on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And thanks to all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to our website, graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you may have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And I want to thank our great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's guest, Alex Nemerov.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Alex. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.